When I first moved out to Fairview Shores, I wasn't looking for trouble. I'd spent the better part of my life keeping the peace either in uniform or behind blueprints working as a marine engineer in the Navy. After 30 years of structure, silence was what I craved. Silence and water. My modest home sat at the edge of the community lake, a glittering spring-fed expanse tucked behind a crescent of whispering pines. Most people here considered it a decorative feature, a bragging right for neighborhood brochures. But to me, it was sacred. The lake reminded me of deployments past, of early morning checks on engines, while the sea licked the side of the vessel like a living thing. And when I built my own dock, simple and sturdy with a bench at the end, I wasn't just claiming convenience. I was reclaiming peace. The dock wasn't fancy. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was for launching my old aluminum rowboat, the kind you can't even find new anymore. I'd sit out there most mornings before the sun crested the trees, sipping black coffee, listening to the loons, and letting my joints settle into the day. The HOA had approved the dock years ago when I first submitted the design. I had the emails printed, signed, and stored in a manila folder, just in case. Because one thing the Navy teaches you is to never assume approval is permanent. People change. Policies drift. And drift they did. When the HOA board elections rolled around last fall, I didn't think much of it. I voted out of courtesy, checked a few boxes, and forgot the names before the ink dried. That's when Karen Haverly entered the picture. She was new to the neighborhood, had moved in just before summer into one of the renovated lakefront properties 2 doors down. A tidy 3-story modern build with aggressive landscaping and a porch camera that blinked red every time I walked past with a fishing rod. I didn't trust it, but I tried not to judge. Everyone settles in differently. Karen didn't settle in. She swooped in. Within weeks, she'd joined the HOA board, and not long after that, she'd muscled her way into the presidency. There were whispers about her suing her last HOA in Nevada, about her connection to a local real estate firm. Still, I stayed out of it. She hadn't bothered me, until she did. It started with a letter. A friendly-looking envelope slipped into my mailbox with the HOA logo and a printed notice inside: your dock may be out of compliance with current architectural guidelines. Please contact the HOA within 10 business days to schedule an inspection. I read it twice. May be out of compliance. The guidelines hadn't changed in years, and my dock had been approved and untouched since 2011. I walked straight to my filing cabinet, pulled out the folder labeled HOA, dock, and reread the original approval. Everything was there: diagram, measurements, permit stamps, even the thank you note from the former board president, Hank. But still I called. The line rang 6 times before a tinny voicemail picked up: "This is the Fairview Shores HOA. Leave a message." I did. Twice, then emailed. No response. A week later, another envelope came. This time it was more direct. "Your dock is officially under review. Usage privileges are temporarily suspended pending investigation." That was the first time I felt the ripple of real anger. Not confusion, not concern, anger. Because this wasn't some mistake, this was deliberate. I took a walk that evening, slow, and measured past the new black SUV parked in Karen's driveway, past the fresh mulch and the ornamental grasses, and down toward the boardwalk, where a few other docks lined the curve of the lake. I noticed something. Mine was the only one flagged with a bright orange ribbon tied to the nearest post. The others untouched. At the corner of the cul-de-sac, I ran into Jim, retired teacher, widower, lives, with a golden retriever named Lucky. We'd shared beers a few times during storms when the power went out. "Did you get a letter about your dock?" I asked. Jim blinked. "What letter?" I told him. He laughed, but it wasn't a funny laugh, more like a resigned one. "I bet it's because you're on that little inlet. Karen's been sniffing around there. Said something about equality of access at the last board meeting." Equality of access. I stared at the lake that night long after the moon had risen, the surface silver and still. The word access rang in my ears like a threat disguised as policy. They weren't questioning the structure. They were questioning my right to exist quietly on the edge of their control. The next morning, my dock was still there. The rowboat bobbed, gently, rope tied loose, the waterline creeping up the legs of the pilings. Everything looked normal, but I could feel it in my gut. Things were shifting. I wasn't dealing with a confused HOA anymore. I was dealing with a force that wanted power. And power rarely cares about fairness when it's dressed in policy. I made my coffee, walked out to the bench, and sat in the creaking morning silence. My hand touched the worn wood rail where I'd once taught my nephew how to tie a bowline. I took a breath. Karen didn't know who she was picking a fight with, and she had no idea what I knew about water boundaries, submerged structures, and shoreline law. She would, soon. It was 2 days after the second notice when Karen showed up on my property. She didn't knock. She didn't call ahead. I was on the back deck oiling the joints of my old garden bench when I heard the click of heels on stone. That sound didn't belong here. Everyone around these parts wore boots, sneakers, or like me, bare feet if they could get away with it. But here came Karen walking confidently in a white blouse, clipboard in hand, sunglasses perched on her head like she was scouting a movie location. Mr. Mercer, she called, though we both knew who I was. I stood, wiped my hands on a rag, and gave a slow nod. You must be Karen. She smiled the kind of smile that says, I already know I'm in charge. Yes, HOA president. I'm just doing a site check on a few unresolved items. Mind if I take a quick look at your dock? I didn't answer right away. My gut said, don't let her near it. But my mind, trained by decades of protocol, told me to let her talk. Let her hang herself with her own words. I'd seen it in tribunal rooms before. Some people can't help but overreach. I gestured with my hand. It's right where it's always been. Karen stepped past me without another word, heels stabbing into the grass, clipboard raised like she was measuring the air. I followed, hands in my back pockets, quiet. When she reached the dock, she tilted her head as if she'd discovered something new. This structure seems unusually long, she noted, flipping a page on her clipboard. And the extension over the water exceeds the 5-foot guideline. I stepped beside her. That guideline was passed 2 years after this dock was built. It was grandfathered in. I have the documentation. She turned, almost surprised I had spoken with authority. You do? I smiled. Would you like me to email it to the board again, or do you prefer a hard copy? She didn't answer that. Instead, she crouched near one of the support beams and took a picture with her phone. For records, she said flatly. Then, without permission, she stepped onto the dock. The creaking of her heels on the boards made my jaw tighten. She walked slowly to the end, took a panoramic photo, then turned and called over her shoulder. You know this is technically common property, right? The lake and shoreline fall under HOA jurisdiction. I didn't move. That's not entirely true. She lowered her sunglasses. Excuse me. I've got the original property survey. This dock sits on my deeded land. The shoreline boundary was established before the HOA was even formed. And the lake, it's only common property to the waterline, not what's below it. Karen laughed. That's not how it works. I looked out over the water. It is if you've read the County Easements and Riparian Rights Code. Section 12B. It covers dock ownership and subsurface control on private lakefronts. Her smile thinned. You're very prepared. I'm very retired, I said, which means I have time. That seemed to catch her off guard. She tried to recover with another smile, softer this time. I'm sure we can resolve this without conflict, but the board has concerns. The dock appears unsafe. No handrails, aging materials. It might pose a liability to residents, especially if it's considered part of the community. It's not. Well, she said, tapping the edge of her clipboard. That's to be determined. I watched her walk away, hair-bouncing voice already on a Bluetooth call before she reached her driveway. Later that evening, I received another letter, this one taped to my front door. No envelope, no signature, just a printed sheet. Notice of HOA enforcement action. Effective immediately, dock usage prohibited until structural assessment completed. Violation code 4.9.3. Unsafe common structures. Common structure. There it was again. I called a friend of mine, Danny, who'd worked with me back in the Navy and now did contract work for shoreline restoration. He wasn't a lawyer, but he knew property boundaries like the back of his weathered hands. Mark the survey pins, he told me. Photograph everything. GPS stamp it. Then put up a sign, private property. Do not trespass. If she moves past that, it's a civil violation. So I did. The next morning, I dug out my old survey, confirmed the boundaries, and staked fresh markers where the land met the lake. I even installed a small motion camera pointed at the dock. Nothing fancy, just enough to keep an eye on things. But it didn't stop them. On Thursday, I came home from a trip to the hardware store and found the dock roped off. Bright yellow nylon rope stretched between two metal stakes with an HOA placard that read, "Temporarily closed for safety inspection. Do not use." They had no right. No inspection had occurred. No letter, no hearing, no vote. They were testing me. I took pictures of everything. I left the rope untouched, but installed a second sign of my own right next to theirs. Private property trespassing will result in legal action. Owner retains full rights under County Code A12B. I didn't expect it to scare them off. Karen wasn't the kind to back down. But it wasn't for her. It was for the paper trail. Because something deeper was rising beneath the surface of this HOA. This wasn't about safety. This wasn't about aesthetics. This was about control. I started digging deeper into the HOA's charter. I reread the bylaws, all 47 pages. I flagged sections, highlighted contradictory clauses, and noted where Karen had violated her own enforcement protocols. Then I found it. A clause buried in the amendment records passed quietly 3 years ago under a former president. No changes or enforcements may be levied upon properties with pre-existing legal water structures unless deemed hazardous by certified county inspectors. Not HOA inspectors. County. And no inspection had taken place, which meant everything she'd done was a bluff. And bluffs in my world were opportunities. That night I didn't sleep much. I stood on the back deck around 2 a.m., looking out over the lake, moonlight flickering on the ripples like the rhythm of something ancient. And beneath those ripples, beneath the dock I'd built with my own hands, I saw exactly what I needed to do. Not just to protect it, but to defend what it meant. By sunrise, the lake was wrapped in fog. A quiet hush had fallen over the neighborhood, the kind that made even the wind tread lightly between trees. I walked outside with my coffee, expecting the usual calm, the kind that made me feel like this place was finally mine again, even just for a few hours. But the silence was broken by the click of metal. I stopped at the edge of the deck, staring out toward the dock. Something was wrong. There was a chain. Wrapped around the first post of the walkway and hooked through the railing was a thick, shiny padlock, a new one. And hanging from the chain was a laminated tag that read, HOA seizure in effect. Do not remove. Below that in bold red letters, Violation Code 55127, Unauthorized Construction on Common Property. I blinked once, twice. For a moment, I thought it had to be a prank. Or maybe someone overstepping their authority. But when I walked closer, the HOA's seal, stamped, embossed, and dated, was there on the tag, signed in black ink. Karen Haverly, President, Fairview Shores Homeowners Association. I stood still, hands shaking, not with fear but fury. Cold, concentrated fury. They had crossed a line. I pulled out my phone and started documenting everything. Pictures from every angle. Close-ups of the seal. I even recorded a video of myself standing next to the sign timestamped stating that this was private property and that the HOA had no authority to seize any part of it. Then I walked straight back inside and made 2 phone calls. The first was to the county recorder's office. Hi, yes, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I need to confirm the property boundaries and structure permits for a residential dock on Fairview Lake. The woman on the other end, Gloria, was patient. She confirmed that I had an existing structure permit approved in 2011 and that it was still valid. She even emailed me the scanned copy for good measure. No recent inspection requests filed on this property either, she added. No code enforcement actions on record. I thanked her, hung up, and made the second call to Charlie Ellison, a retired JAG officer who lived across town. We'd served together once briefly, and I knew he had a hobby for land use litigation. Charlie answered with a gravelly Mark Mercer. Haven't heard that voice in years. HOAs chained my dock, I said. There was a pause. Then tell me everything. By the time I finished explaining, Charlie was already clicking away on his laptop. Send me the photos. Email me everything you've got. I'll draft a cease and desist within the hour. I did exactly that. Then I made copies, physical ones, of every document I compiled. The original dock approval, the deed showing the waterline boundary, the county map, the statute, Karen's laminated tag. I placed them all in a fresh folder and labeled it in block letters. HOA interference, active. Because that's what it was now. Not a disagreement. Not a misunderstanding. Interference. Later that afternoon, I walked the edge of the lake again. The fog had lifted, revealing Karen's pristine house in full sunshine. Her windows were open, and somewhere inside classical music played a piano piece I couldn't name, but one that felt smug, like everything was going according to her plan. I caught her out front around 4 p.m., pruning a bush that didn't need pruning. "Karen," I said calmly, arms folded, documents under one elbow. She looked up, forced a smile. "Mark, lovely day. You entered my property." She straightened. "No, the dock is HOA controlled as per section 5.1.7. That's not what the county says." Karen sighed, set her shears down, and wiped her gloves on her shirt. "Look, I understand you're upset, but these rules exist for a reason. We have a responsibility to maintain community standards. Your dock, however charming, is a liability. No one's fallen off it in 12 years. Yet she said, emphasizing the word. I handed her a copy of the documents. Here's the original permit, the easement, and the county ruling on riparian rights. This is deeded land. You don't have jurisdiction." She barely glanced at it. "Well, that's for the board to decide." "No," I said firmly. "It's for the court to decide now." Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She hadn't expected pushback. Not like this. "I've already filed a formal complaint with the county," I continued, "and I've retained legal counsel. If that chain isn't gone by tomorrow morning, I'll be filing for trespass and property seizure without lawful cause." She blinked. I left her standing there holding the paper's mouth slightly open. Back at home, I stared at the lock again. I could have cut it myself. I had bolt cutters in the shed. But I wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. Let her be the one who broke first. The next morning, the chain was still there. But something else had changed. My boat, my old aluminum rowboat, the one I used every Sunday for fishing, was gone. I rushed down to the shoreline, heart pounding, feet wet in the early dew. The rope that had tethered it was frayed, cleanly cut. Not torn, cut. There were drag marks in the sand leading back toward the walking path. Tire tracks from a dolly or cart. I stood there staring at the water, my chest rising and falling in silent fury. This wasn't just policy anymore. This was war. By mid-morning, I had filed a police report, not just for the stolen boat, but for the tampering and unauthorized lockout of private property. I didn't know if the sheriff's deputy would actually pursue it, but it didn't matter. The paper trail had begun. Charlie called me that afternoon. "She's playing dirty," he said. "But we're going to play smarter." "I want to hit her where it hurts," I said. Charlie chuckled. "What do you think she cares about most?" I thought about the lake. The private boat she kept tied at her personal dock. The massive lakefront party she was rumored to be throwing next weekend for some real estate investors. I smiled slowly. "Her image," I said, "and her boat." Charlie paused, then said, "Then let's make sure she crashes into the truth." That night, I sat on my deck with a flashlight and began to draft a design. It would look like landscaping on the surface, but underwater. It would be all rock angled and legal marked with buoys in the county file, but invisible to anyone who thought they could own the lake. There's something about being in the Navy that rewires how you handle conflict. You don't shout, you don't flail, you assess, you measure. You wait for the tide to shift and then you strike with precision. That mindset doesn't go away just because the uniform does. So when Karen cut my dock from under me and took my boat like it was a lawn ornament I didn't yell. I got methodical. I spent the rest of that evening down in my basement pulling out old project boxes from my time as a marine systems engineer. Blueprints, hydrological charts, sonar scans, modeling, software, some of it outdated, sure. But the fundamentals of water dynamics hadn't changed, and neither had the laws governing them. I opened a folder labeled Nearshore Defense, Chile 2009, and found exactly what I was looking for: submerged obstacle layouts used for environmental protection, legal, natural, and most importantly, visible only if you knew where to look. I started sketching 3 layers of river rock and granite, angled to prevent shoreline erosion, spaced to create a current break, but dense enough to stop a mid-size motorboat moving at party speed. Not enough to sink anything. This wasn't revenge. It was reinforcement. Defensive architecture built from experience. I placed each marker within my riparian boundary. The legal water ownership defined by my property line, extending into the lake, something most homeowners don't even realize they own. But I did. And I had maps from 2011 proving it. By morning, I was at the quarry 2 towns over talking to a guy named Eric, who owed me a favor from helping his nephew get into the Naval Academy. We loaded my truck with stone. That afternoon, I brought in 2 teenage brothers from the neighborhood, strong kids who needed summer work and didn't ask questions. By the time the sun dipped low over Fairview Lake, we'd created a half-moon of submerged rock, about 4 feet beyond my dock. It blended into the natural lake bed, but created a subtle rise, one that would jolt any speeding boat hard enough to get their attention. I documented every step. GPS coordinates, depth measurements before and after photos. I even flagged it with 2 temporary floating markers purely for liability purposes and purely to demonstrate that I'd taken every precaution in accordance with county environmental codes. I wasn't hiding anything, but I wasn't advertising it either. That night, I emailed the full layout to Charlie. He called me 5 minutes later. "You built a passive aquatic barricade," he said, a slow grin in his voice. "That's genius." "I built a boundary," I said. "One she won't see until it's too late." Over the next few days, the neighborhood settled into a tense calm. Karen was quiet, too quiet. The chain remained on my dock, though someone had replaced the laminated notice with a newer, more aggressive version, now mentioning escalated enforcement. I ignored it. Instead, I made rounds to the neighbors. It started with Jim and his dog Lucky, then moved on to Diane and her husband Carl, then old Mrs. Langford, whose garden was a local legend. I didn't complain. I just shared documents. Gently, clearly with highlighted lines about riparian rights and property easement. I showed them the survey maps, the approval letter from the county, and the list of HOA bylaws Karen had violated. One by one, their expression shifted from detached curiosity to concern to something closer to loyalty. "She tried to fine us for a flag," Jim said. "She said my wind chimes were audible pollution," Diane added. Mrs. Langford just sighed and said, "She made me remove my sunflowers." Sunflowers mark. By the time I was done, 5 more neighbors had signed affidavits that they had received threatening or unclear enforcement from the HOA in the last month alone. All of it papered, notarized, and added to the growing file I kept next to my bed like a loaded weapon. I wasn't just defending my dock anymore. I was building up case. Then came the email. Subject: HOA Special Lakefront Event, Saturday 5 p.m. Sent from the official board account, the message gleamed with confidence. Join us for an exclusive HOA appreciation boat party, hosted by President Karen Haverly. Light music, wine, and hors d'oeuvres provided. Launch from community dock or board from Karen's private boat for a scenic lake cruise. Dress attire, summer chic. I read it twice. Then I smiled. Because I knew something Karen didn't. Her private boat may have been tied to her dock, but her intended route, the one that looped wide across the southern bend of the lake, cut directly through the submerged rock boundary she refused to acknowledge. The one built on land she claimed to control. The same path she'd used to bypass my dock when she chained it off. I did not warn her. I did not interfere. Instead, I walked down to the dock that night, sat on the bench she tried to claim, and watched the moonlight shimmer above the silent shield I had built beneath the surface. The water looked calm, but calm isn't the same as safe. Saturday arrived with the kind of summer energy that made the lake come alive. Dragonflies skimming the surface, kids hollering from across lawns, and grills firing up in the distance, with the smell of smoke and spice drifting on the breeze. The neighborhood looked festive, unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring the storm simmering beneath it. I kept to myself most of the day. Replaced a broken hinge on the side gate, trimmed the hedges, reapplied sealant to the edge of the dock post, though it didn't need it. Idle hands are dangerous when you've got this much riding on silence. At precisely 4:30 p.m., I heard the music. Classical at first, Vivaldi, maybe then shifting into something that sounded like yacht club jazz. A beat too bright for the setting sun. I stepped out onto my back deck, dry rag in one hand, coffee in the other. Karen's boat was gleaming like a showroom model, white hull, chrome trim, navy canvas cover rolled back like she wanted everyone to see what she could afford. It was a luxury cruiser bigger than anything else on the lake. Too big, really, for this kind of private community. Neighbors began to gather near the communal dock, all dressed too carefully for a casual lake event. Summer chic, just like the email had ordered. Linen pants, boat shoes, pastel scarves, and wide sunglasses. Karen herself emerged from her property wearing a coral-wrapped dress, hair coiled into a bun clipboard in one hand, flute of champagne in the other. She was smiling. Radiant, even. But there was something forced in the way she kept scanning the crowd, like she expected me to show up. Like she wanted me to, so she could put on a performance. But I didn't go. I sat on my dock bench, just barely in her periphery, polishing a piece of driftwood like it mattered. I made no eye contact, no acknowledgement. I just waited. At 5:07 p.m., Karen's boat started moving. She didn't pilot it herself, of course not. A young guy I didn't recognize was at the helm, likely hired for the day. She waved from the bow glass, raised posture, elegant. Several neighbors clapped politely. A few filmed on their phones. I saw her point in my direction and laugh, probably a jab about me boycotting the party. Then the boat turned. Just slightly. Not enough for anyone else to notice. But I noticed. She wasn't taking the wide route toward the communal docks loop. She was cutting across the southern bend. My bend. Exactly the way she'd done 2 weeks earlier, the morning she placed the chain on my dock. Only this time, there was something under the water. Something she couldn't see. I stood slowly, walked to the edge of my dock, and rested both hands on the railing. Karen's cruiser glided forward at an arrogant speed. The lake was calm, but her wake was larger than necessary, showy. Disrespectful. She didn't know. Not yet. I watched as the hull moved into the marked GPS coordinates I had diagrammed earlier in the week. The young driver didn't slow down. He couldn't have seen the subtle rise in the water, the minute shimmer of tension on the surface, where the rocks changed the current flow. No one could have unless they knew what to look for. Then, crack. The sound rang across the lake like a gunshot. Gasps erupted from the neighbors still on shore. The boat jolted hard, lurching left. Karen stumbled forward, catching herself on the polished rail. Her champagne flute shattered, spraying gold against white fiberglass. The bow had slammed into the first row of submerged rock-angled granite, carefully placed just beneath the draft line of boats like hers. Not sharp enough to pierce, but strong enough to stop. The driver threw it into reverse, but it was too late. The starboard side caught another formation, scraping hard. I could hear the shriek of metal on stone. People were shouting now. Someone had started filming. I stayed silent, just watched. Karen turned, mouth open in disbelief, searching the shoreline. Her eyes met mine, and I didn't blink. I didn't wave. I didn't smirk. I just stood there, arms crossed, the breeze catching my shirt like a flag. The boat eventually reversed free, but not before the damage had been done, literal and metaphorical. The crowd on the dock had gone quiet. Several people began murmuring. A few turned and walked away entirely. I returned to my bench. By 5:30, the party had dissolved. By 6:15, Karen's boat was back in her slip, tilted slightly, listing on the right. The chrome was scratched. The lower hull showed 2 fresh gouges just above the waterline. Not enough to breach, but enough that a repair team would be called. Insurance would ask questions, and her composure, that was cracked beyond fixing. Around 700, as the sun dipped behind the tree line, I heard footsteps approaching. It wasn't Karen. It was Jim. "Mark," he said quietly, sitting beside me on the bench. "Evening." He looked out over the lake. Heard it was rocks. "Natural shoreline protection," I said. He gave a half smile. "You always did love geology." I nodded. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then he said, "She's going to come after you harder now." "I know." "You ready for that?" I turned to him. I was ready the moment she thought the water was hers. He nodded again and stood. "You've got more allies than you think, Mark." That night, I lit the lantern on the dock and left it burning long after midnight. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt still, like the lake itself had taken a breath on my behalf. But I also knew something else. Karen wasn't going to go down quietly. She'd scream. She'd threaten. And she'd try to twist the story. But I had truth. I had proof. And now I had witnesses. By the next morning, the neighborhood was buzzing, not with lawnmowers or sprinklers like usual, but with whispers. Whispers about Karen's boat. Whispers about the grinding sound echoing across the lake. Whispers about how the HOA president had thrown a fancy party, only to nearly sink her luxury cruiser on a lake she supposedly controlled. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to say a word. Other people were already doing the talking for me. Diane texted me a blurry photo of Karen clinging to the bow rail, champagne-soaked, as the boat lurched sideways. Carl sent me a clip he'd captured on his phone of the actual impact. The sound was unmistakable metal colliding with stone. And then came the real surprise. A short video posted anonymously to the Fairview Shores Community Bulletin Facebook group. Timestamped with a simple caption. "Is this how we treat common water?" It had over 250 views by lunchtime. Karen didn't show her face that day. Her house was shuttered. The cruiser sat silent in the slip, a canvas tarp thrown over it haphazardly, one side still visibly dented. No HOA updates, no apologies, no mention of the party fallout. But the silence wouldn't last. At 4:12 p.m., I received a certified letter shoved under my door. Notice of formal HOA complaint. Emergency safety violation. Due to an unpermitted submerged obstruction discovered near the southern lake quadrant, you, Mr. Mark Mercer, are being held liable for endangering HOA members and guests. An emergency hearing will be scheduled. You are instructed to remove all unauthorized materials from the lake immediately or face fines and litigation. No signature, just a stamp, HOA Enforcement Division. I let the letter sit on the kitchen table. Then I opened my laptop and printed off the Environmental Compliance Certificate. I had filed with the county 2 days before the party, complete with GPS coordinates, ecological purpose, justification, and photos. Not only was my structure legal, it was recorded, transparent, public. I emailed the PDF to Charlie. His reply was instant. Perfect. Let her try. She just turned a minor enforcement disagreement into a criminal accusation, without evidence. I wasn't scared. I was insulted. That evening, a black sedan pulled into my driveway. Not HOA this time. Deputy Sheriff Leland, a broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor and a thick notepad. He greeted me with a nod. Afternoon, Mr. Mercer. Mind if I ask you a few questions about the incident on the lake yesterday? I stepped aside and motioned him to the back deck. We both sat overlooking the water. I've heard a few versions of what happened, he began. One is that a natural rock bed in the lake damaged a boat. The other is that someone intentionally created a hazard. I handed him the environmental certificate. Filed, marked, measured, and cleared, I said. It's shoreline protection, not a hazard. Same kind of structure the county recommends to prevent erosion. He flipped through the pages. The HOA's president is claiming otherwise. Says you placed them with intent to harm. I exhaled slowly. Can intent be proven when the structure was declared in advance, marked properly, and built within legal boundary lines on private property? He gave a thoughtful look, then nodded. Fair point. Any reason she might want to target you specifically? I stared out at the lake for a moment before answering. Because I said no. Leland chuckled, closed the folder, and stood. We'll file it. But between you and me, it looks like she hit something she wasn't looking for. As he left, he paused by the cruiser, still docked in Karen's slip. Hell of a dent, he murmured, shaking his head. The sun was going down when the HOA finally broke its silence. An emergency HOA board email went out to all residents. Subject: unpermitted alteration to common lake area. We regret to inform the community of a dangerous obstruction located in the shared waters of Fairview Shores. We are investigating potential tampering that resulted in vessel damage during the HOA's scheduled appreciation event. Any residents with information are urged to come forward. Disciplinary action is forthcoming. The email was cold, vague, but the message was clear. They were coming for me, but they didn't anticipate what came next. At 9:06 p.m., a second post hit the community Facebook group, this one from Diane. I've known Mark Mercer for 12 years. He built that dock himself with his bare hands. He's always maintained it cleaned the lake debris and helped my husband when his canoe capsized. If there's someone we should be questioning, it's the person who tried to take his dock without proof or process. It had 47 likes in an hour. By midnight, 5 more neighbors had commented, sharing their own stories of Karen's arbitrary fines, her hostile letters, her constant surveillance. One even attached a screenshot of the HOA bylaws Karen had violated by acting without board approval. And in the middle of it all was a still photo from the boat crash video, frozen on Karen's face the moment she realized she was no longer in control. The next day, I walked down to the lake. The sun reflected off the water like glass. My dock, still chained, sat in stoic silence. I leaned on the post and whispered to myself, she started it with a clipboard, she'll end it with a gavel. Because now she'd escalated it beyond neighborhood drama. She'd made it legal. And if it's a fight in court she wanted, I was going to give her the battle of her life. The morning after the Facebook post went semi-viral within our neighborhood, I stepped outside to find something I hadn't seen in years. An HOA board member standing at the edge of my lawn, trying not to look directly at my house. It wasn't Karen. It was Brian Ellis, the treasurer, A man who always dressed like he was late for a golf game and never made eye contact longer than 3 seconds. He had a clipboard in hand, of course, and sunglasses that looked more like armor than fashion. I watched him for a moment before approaching. "Brian," I said calmly, "you here to deliver more accusations, or are you finally ready to tell the truth?" He flinched slightly, then cleared his throat. "Just conducting a follow-up observation related to last weekend's incident." "You mean the one where your president illegally commandeered my dock, crashed her boat, and then blamed me for existing?" He said nothing, scribbled something on his clipboard that was probably meaningless. Then he walked away. That would have been the end of it, just another non-confrontation in a string of absurdities, if not for the white van that pulled up 2 hours later. Channel 4 News, Local Affairs Unit, was painted across the side. I stood frozen on the porch as a young woman and a camera operator approached. She was holding a microphone and wearing a power blue blazer. Her name tag read, Lana Vieira. "Mr. Mercer," she asked, friendly but direct. "Do you have a moment? We're covering a developing story regarding alleged abuse of power by the Fairview Shores HOA and a potential property rights violation tied to an incident on the lake." Karen had brought this on herself. "You came fast," I said. She nodded. "We were tagged in a community post by one of your neighbors, Diane. It's gathering traction online. Our newsroom decided to investigate. I didn't invite them inside. I walked them down to the dock. This," I said, pointing at the thick chain, and the warning notice is how it started. "A chain on a dock that I built on land I legally own. No inspection, no vote. Just a decision by one woman who thinks she speaks for the entire lake." The camera rolled. I explained the timeline, every document, every call, every legal step I had taken. I showed them the submerged rock layout, the environmental permit, the GPS-stamped photographs, and I handed them the incident report from the sheriff's office, complete with the deputy's signature confirming no illegal activity on my part. Lana took notes furiously. This, she said, pointing to the laminated HOA notice, wasn't approved by the board. "No," I said. "And I've got 3 board members ready to admit they didn't know about it either." By the time the segment aired that night, the headline read, "Local HOA President Accused of Power Grab After Boat Party Ends in Chaos." They ran the clip of Karen stumbling on her yacht slow motion. They aired my interview, highlighted my Navy background, my knowledge of property law, my attempts to resolve things peacefully. And they played Diane's quote in full. "Mark isn't the problem. He's the solution to what this HOA has become." By the next morning, the neighborhood was divided into 2 clear camps, those who supported Karen, and those who had finally had enough of her. Guess which side had more numbers. But Karen didn't fold, not immediately. Instead, she filed a lawsuit. I received the official notice in a beige envelope slid under my door like a coward's calling card. Plaintiff, Fairview Shores Homeowners Association. Defendant, Mark A. Mercer. Claim reckless endangerment, unauthorized construction, and defamation of HOA leadership. Charlie laughed when I forwarded it to him. "She actually listed defamation of leadership," he said. "That's not even a real legal category. This is a bluff." "She thinks pressure equals power," I said. Charlie snorted. "She's never gone up against someone who understands strategy. We're not playing poker, we're playing chess." And I knew how to play. Over the next few days, we prepared for war. Charlie filed a counterclaim, not just for property interference, but for trespass, libel, illegal seizure, and emotional distress, tied to the theft of my boat, which had mysteriously reappeared behind the HOA clubhouse under a tarp. The deputy confirmed the serial number. Game, set, match. We served them with discovery requests, emails, meeting minutes, voting records, proof of board approval for the dock seizure. And slowly the cracks began to form. Brian caved first. He emailed Charlie privately confessing that no vote had ever been held. Karen had issued the enforcement herself, citing emergency action under a clause that required imminent physical danger, which she never documented. Then Lisa Myers, the board secretary, came forward. She gave us copies of 3 internal emails from Karen, one of which said, "He doesn't deserve that dock. It's the best spot on the lake, and he's wasting it." Another email mentioned, "We need better optics. If Mercer pushes back, spin it like he's being aggressive. The news won't check." But the news had checked, and so had the neighbors. The HOA meeting scheduled for that weekend was standing room only. I didn't plan to attend until Jim knocked on my door holding his ball cap and asking if I would speak on behalf of everyone who felt steamrolled but never knew how to fight back. So I went. And when I stood in front of those 60-something neighbors, retirees, single parents, tired teachers, weary landscapers, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't call names. I just told the truth. About my dock. About the chain. About the crash. And about how power doesn't mean permission. When I finished, Karen stood to respond. Her voice cracked halfway through her opening statement. She tried to accuse me of manipulating the media. But then someone in the crowd shouted, "You stole his boat." Another voice, "You told my wife to take down her swing set. Then you fined me for planting native grass." She froze. And then finally, she screamed. A raw, high-pitched sound that wasn't about logic or law. It was the sound of losing control. She grabbed her binder, knocked over a water pitcher, and stormed out of the meeting hall. By the time I got home that night, Brian had emailed everyone the vote tally. Karen Haverly had been removed from the board by a 47-5 majority. But it wasn't over. The lawsuit was still pending, and I had no intention of settling quietly. Not now. Not after all she'd taken. The courtroom wasn't grand. It was a modest municipal hall converted for local civil hearings, 4 rows of folding chairs, a worn-out county seal behind the bench, and walls that smelled faintly of air conditioning and legal dust. But for all its plainness, it felt like the front line of a long battle. And I wasn't walking in to defend myself. I was walking in to finish what Karen had started. Charlie stood beside me, tie slightly loosened in the back as he whispered strategy. He wasn't just my attorney. He was my shield. Calm, sharp, and precise. In his hands, my case wasn't just solid, it was surgical. Across the room sat Karen and her attorney, a stiff-looking man in a tailored gray suit with a Bluetooth still tucked in his left ear, like he expected to leave any second. Karen herself looked altered. The coral dresses and perfect posture were gone. She wore a dark blazer, her hair pulled into a tight bun that did nothing to soften the tension etched across her face. Her eyes darted toward me only once, then shifted away. We were called to the table. The judge, a silver-haired woman with readers perched at the edge of her nose, introduced herself simply as Judge Linton. She looked at us like a schoolteacher ready to separate squabbling children, but there was intelligence behind those glasses. The kind you don't fool. "Let's proceed," she said. Karen's attorney went first. He launched into a rehearsed tirade about public safety, shared property, and the reckless installation of an unpermitted rock formation in a common-use lake area, tying the damage to the president's boat directly to my malicious and premeditated actions. He even had a printed photo of the boat's dent blown up on a foam board like we were at a science fair. Judge Linton let him finish. Then she turned to Charlie. "Mr. Ellison," Charlie smiled. "Your Honor, we'd like to enter into evidence the following items: the environmental compliance permit filed with the county time-stamped emails from the defendant to the HOA regarding said permit GPS coordinates of the submerged structure and copies of HOA bylaws that clearly state no enforcement can occur without board approval, none of which happened in this case." He handed her a neatly bound folder. But most importantly, he added, "We'd like to call a witness." Judge Linton raised an eyebrow. "A witness?" Charlie nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Lisa Myers, HOA Board Secretary." Karen's head snapped toward her attorney. Lisa walked calmly from the back row, a folder in her hands, and steady eyes that didn't once flinch from Karen's glare. Once sworn-in Lisa testified clearly and firmly Karen had not called for a vote. No official board meeting had taken place. The chain on my dock had been installed without authorization, and worse, she had emails. The courtroom hushed as Lisa read them aloud. "We need better optics. If Mercer pushes back spin it like he's being aggressive, the news won't check. Doesn't deserve that, Doc." You could feel the temperature drop in the room. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming irrelevance. Judge Linton waved him off. "They go directly to motive." Overruled. Then came the bombshell. Charlie brought out a copy of the HOA charter, highlighted and annotated, and pointed directly to a clause in Section 9.2. No member of the board may act unilaterally to seize or alter private property without prior board consensus and documented safety hazard reviewed by a certified municipal officer. Your Honor, Charlie said no safety inspection was performed, no hazard was reported, and no consensus vote was held. This was a personal vendetta carried out under the false pretense of policy. Then he slid a photo across the table. It was my dock before the chain. Me sitting on the bench, cup of coffee in hand. A peaceful image. And beside it, a second photo, the padlocked dock red signage, Karen standing smugly beside it with a clipboard in her hand, lips curled into a smile. "We all know what this is, Your Honor," Charlie said. "It's not enforcement. It's conquest." Karen's lawyer made a feeble rebuttal, but it barely registered. The judge leaned back silent for a long time, then looked at Karen. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Haverly?" Karen opened her mouth, but no words came. Not one. Her eyes darted. Her fingers tightened around her armrest, and for a brief, fragile second, the confident persona cracked entirely. She looked like a child caught scribbling on the walls with permanent ink. Judge Linton sighed and reached for her pen, ruling in favor of the defendant, Mr. Mercer. All claims dismissed. Additionally, the HOA is ordered to remove all encroachments on Mr. Mercer's property and issue a formal written apology for unauthorized seizure and defamation. Court costs to be covered by the HOA. There was no cheer. No applause, just silence. The kind of silence that comes when justice is finally spoken aloud. Karen stood slowly. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. She simply walked out of the courtroom like a deflated balloon, every step heavier than the last. Outside, Charlie clapped a hand on my shoulder. "Well," he said, "that's that." "No," I replied. "That was the easy part." He gave me a curious look. "Now I make sure she never does this to anyone else." You could almost feel the tension bleeding out of the neighborhood. It didn't happen all at once. Of course, these things never do. But there was a shift in the air after the hearing. As if the residents of Fairview Shores had all at the same time exhaled the fear they didn't realize they'd been holding in. The fear that if they stepped out of line, painted a door, the wrong shade flew the wrong flag, planted the wrong tree, they'd be the next target. Karen's defeat hadn't just vindicated me. It had freed them. Within 48 hours of the verdict, her name was quietly removed from the HOA website. A curt email went out to residents stating that Ms. Haverly has stepped down from her position as president due to personal matters and that a special board election would be held to restore transparency and trust. No apology, no accountability. But it didn't matter, because we knew what had happened. The court had spoken, the truth had aired on the evening news, and half the neighborhood had screenshots and receipts saved to their phones. And then, without ceremony, the chain on my dock was gone. I found it lying in the grass one morning, curled like a dead snake, the red HOA placard still attached. No note, no explanation. But I didn't need one. I stood there for a while, hand resting on the post like I was touching a wounded friend who'd survived a hard winter. Then I stepped onto my dock for the first time in weeks, sat down on that old bench, and watched the water reclaim its calm. That afternoon, Jim and Diane stopped by. "We're forming a coalition," Jim said. "An independent homeowners committee. Not an official HOA, just residents who want to hold the board accountable from now on." Diane nodded. "And we want you to be the one to help lead it." I nearly laughed. "I just wanted to be left alone, remember? That's why we trust you," Jim said. "Because you never wanted power. You just wanted peace." And they were right. But peace wasn't something you got by waiting for it. It was something you built. Like a dock, one plank at a time over still waters that could turn stormy without warning. So I agreed. Not to lead, but to protect. We drafted a charter. Nothing legal, nothing binding, but a promise. A list of shared values, neighbor to neighbor, about respect, autonomy, and the understanding that not every problem needs to be solved with a fine or a threat. And something strange started happening. People opened up. Carl from across the cove told me Karen had fined him $150 for a hose coiled improperly on his lawn. Lisa from the Hill admitted she'd been asked to report on her neighbor's recycling bin placement. Even Brian, the former treasurer, stopped by one night with a six-pack and a quiet apology. "She scared me too," he said. "Made me think if I didn't follow her lead, I'd be next." I didn't hold it against him. Most people don't start as tyrants. They just forget how to say no. But not anymore. The next board meeting was the most well-attended in HOA history. And this time, residents spoke up. They questioned fees, challenged vague language, asked for receipts. And when the board's interim president tried to brush them off, someone raised their hand and said, "You don't get to silence us anymore. We know better now." I watched from the back row, hands folded, saying nothing. And then I noticed something else. The dock wasn't just a dock anymore. Neighbors had started dropping by, sitting for a while, bringing coffee, or just quiet company. One couple asked if they could take engagement photos at the bench. A teenager came by to sketch the lake for an art class. Even Lucky Jim's golden retriever had started napping under the bench like it was the safest spot on earth. I didn't say no. I just watched the space heal. A week later, the HOA election was held. 3 new board members were voted, in each of them residents who had stood up at the last meeting and asked hard questions. Brian chose not to run again. Lisa stayed on this time as vice president, her quiet strength finally being recognized. Karen. No one heard from her again. Her house was listed for sale within a month. Some said she moved back to Nevada. Others whispered about lawsuits in other communities. But I didn't follow. I didn't need to know. She was the storm that passed. And we were the ones left standing. One afternoon, Charlie called to tell me that the counterclaim settlement had been finalized. They're offering a formal HOA apology and full reimbursement for legal expenses, he said, plus $5,000 for the boat damage and emotional distress. I raised an eyebrow. Emotional distress. He laughed. Take the win, Mark. I did. Not because I needed the money, but because it meant they finally admitted it. And that mattered. But the real victory, that came the next morning when I walked out to my dock and saw a small wooden sign someone had placed beside the bench. It wasn't fancy. Just a carved piece of cedar, sealed in weatherproof lacquer. 3 words. Mercer's Peace Pier. No one claimed credit. But I knew what it meant. This wasn't about ownership anymore. It was about what we protect when no one's watching. The wind shifted that day gentler, somehow. Not just in the air, but in the tone of the neighborhood. For the first time in what felt like months, Fairview Shores breathed without flinching. I stood at the edge of my dock, Mercer's Peace Pier, as it was now affectionately called, and let my hand brush against the new cedar sign. The engraving was clean, the grain soft under my fingers. Someone had taken their time with it. Someone had cared. It wasn't about vanity. It wasn't about winning. It was about restoration, not just of property, but of dignity. Over the next few weeks, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't realized I missed. The lake no longer felt like a battlefield. Kids began fishing off their family docks again without fear of an HOA citation. Lawn chairs started reappearing on front porches. There were chalk drawings on sidewalks, wind chimes on patios, garden gnomes defiantly tucked beside rose bushes, and laughter. God, I hadn't heard that in a long time. Laughter that wasn't tight with anxiety or tempered by whispers. Just laughter open, alive, unsupervised. One afternoon, Diane brought over lemon bars and asked if she could host the next book club on the dock. I said yes, of course. That evening, 5 women in wide-brimmed hats and folding chairs appeared discussing fiction and sipping iced tea, while ducks floated lazily in the background. I kept my distance, just watching from the deck. It felt right. Then came the email. It was from the new HOA president, Carla Jenkins, a soft-spoken woman who had lived here for over 20 years and had never once sent a notice about mailbox height or hedge trimming. Mr. Mercer. On behalf of the newly elected board of Fairview Shores, I want to extend our gratitude for your patience, your persistence, and for reminding us all what leadership should look like. We've officially amended our charter to require full board consensus and resident review for any future property enforcement actions. Your case taught us that policy without empathy is just control. Also, we hope you'll consider joining our newly formed advisory committee. No pressure, just an invitation from neighbors who want your wisdom. I stared at the message for a long time. I didn't answer it right away. Instead, I grabbed a coffee, headed down to the dock, and sat on the bench. My bench, watching the water shift and shimmer like it always had. The thing about battles, especially quiet ones, is that even when you win, you carry the weight of what you had to do to survive them. I didn't want to live in resistance anymore. I wanted to live in belonging. The next morning, I accepted the offer. Advisory only. No title, no vote. Just a chair at the table. Just a voice steady and calm to say, wait when others want to rush toward control. To say why when someone demands punishment. To remind them that homeowners are humans first. A few nights later, I received a letter in the mail. Not an email, Not a notice. A real letter handwritten. No return address. The handwriting was elegant, the ink blue, the paper thick. Mark, you were right. I let power make me small. I thought control would keep me safe, but all it did was make me afraid. I hope someday you can forgive me. I'm not asking to return, just hoping you understand. K. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into the folder I kept labeled OA, Final Documents. Not because I wanted to revisit the past, but because I needed to remember what unhealed people can become when given unchecked power. I said a quiet prayer for her. Then I let it go. The summer turned to fall. Golden leaves floated gently onto the lake's surface. The mornings grew colder, the mist a little thicker. But the dock remained solid, patient, quietly watching. Sometimes I'd see someone standing at the edge of it when I woke up early, one of the teenagers from down the road, or an older couple holding hands. They never asked permission, and I never told them they needed to. The dock didn't belong to the HOA. It didn't even belong to me, not really. It belonged to the idea that a person's home should never feel like a trap. That no committee should dictate how peace is felt, how freedom is expressed, or how healing begins. And maybe that's why I fought. Not just for my dock, but for the quiet right to be. To sit on wood I had cut myself. To drink coffee beside morning fog. To reclaim something no policy could take away. One Sunday morning, Jim and I sat side by side on the bench, Lucky snoozing at our feet, the lake-like glass. "You ever think it'd come to this?" he asked. I shrugged. No, but I'm glad it did. Why? Because now I know who I'm surrounded by. He nodded, eyes distant. And then he said something I'll never forget. "You didn't just save your dock, Mark. You saved the soul of this neighborhood." I didn't answer. I just stared out at the water, at the place where Karen's boat had once struck the rocks, at the place where power had met quiet resistance and lost. The waves were small, but they kept moving, just like we did. And in that steady, unstoppable motion, I found peace. Right where I'd always been. Right where I'd always belonged.